Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that is discussed nowhere near as much as it should be. Brain drain. Brain drain is a phenomenon that affects every single person living on this planet. Even you, dear viewer. Now I'm sure you have many questions, such as, what is brain drain? What are some examples of brain drain? And how does brain drain affect me? So let's start off right at the beginning. Back in medieval times, the vast majority of people would spend their entire lives living in the same place as they were born. Growing up in a small village, as most people did, it's pretty much guaranteed that you'd know almost everyone living there by name, as in all likelihood, you probably went to school with them, or at the very least, knew someone who did. Familiarity, kinship, and especially belonging isn't just something that humans tend to throw away unless there's a good reason to do so, such as the fear of impending war or perhaps a famine. But even then, people would usually move out as a group anyway. Very few people would individually leave their hometowns in the pursuit of, say, careers or simple flat-out wealth, as the idea of leaving behind your family and your greater community at large for such material aims would have been translated by most as selfish and almost like a betrayal, mostly because there was simply no real need to do so. As stated, every village was its own community, and such communities almost always produced their own products, such as food, drinks, etc. Why? Let's say you had two villages, Arstown and Bumshire. An egg made in Arstown might cost just 2 gold there, but if they went to Bumshire to sell the exact same egg, the price would inevitably go up to, say, 3 gold, as to cover the travel time required to get there in the first place. Which would probably make such an endeavour not worth it, as if Bumshire produced its own eggs locally, then they are almost guaranteed to be cheaper. And the fact that, well, the people of Bumshire are probably more likely to support their own friends and neighbours above that of a stranger. The overall point being that because in the past, travelling long distances was such a time-consuming process, economic value was for the most part determined simply via location. After all, time is money. Just by virtue of living somewhere, your skills inherently had value, so long as no one else locally could do what you could do. So for the most part, people simply stuck to locally produced goods, and as such, every village had a wide array of jobs available that would usually be passed down in the family. Hence why a lot of people have last names such as Smith, Baker, and Cartwright. During these times, local goods was the king. However, with the invention of vehicles such as boats, cars, and planes, travel, all of a sudden, became much less of a burden. And as such, trade and the geographic dynamics of it would completely and utterly transform. Take Arstown and Bumshire for example. By walking, it might have taken 30 minutes to travel from one to the other. But in a car, that time could now be slashed to a mere 5 minutes at most. All of a sudden, the home advantage of the egg price is incredibly marginal at best, with only local reputation remaining as an advantage. But forget Arstown and Bumshire for a moment, what about Crap City? Crap City has a much higher population, much more goods, and better means to make them. Whereas Arstown and Bumshire only have small farms, Crap City has a behemoth, and as such is able to produce much more eggs and sell them for much cheaper. Inevitably, Crap City's 1 gold each eggs slowly start seeping into Arstown and Bumshire, and before you know it, their local traders can't compete and are out of business. And this is what happened to almost every small business. They got owned. Whereas in the past, people would buy from their local village shop, today, people buy from giant corporate-owned supermarkets that through sheer economies of scale have managed to annihilate all of their local competition. Local goods are king, no more. If you would have told someone, even just 100 years ago, that it was possible that someone living up here in Manchester would be able to purchase their produce from the exact same company as people living down here in London, they would have never believed you. And yet, here we are. Now, in a way, I guess you could say this has been a good thing, as it means that we're no longer tied to the products produced within our local areas. So if you live in the middle of the arse end of nowhere in the Scottish Highlands, it doesn't really matter, as at least you'll still be able to know the joy of what Walker's chili and chocolate flavoured crisps taste like. Phew. However, this also naturally created a huge problem when it came to jobs. As location was essentially no longer an economic advantage, many local family businesses would shut down, leading to a huge vacancy when it came to employment. In the end, the people who would have once owned the local shop would now instead work for the corporation who moved in to take their place, which, needless to say, wouldn't pay anywhere near as much. People slowly started to realise that if they wanted to make any sort of respectable income or perhaps have some level of independence at all, then they'd have to move away from being product producers into pursuing more service sector careers instead. Enter the university. In the past, hardly anyone went to university. Higher education was reserved for only the most intellectual and academically gifted in society. And the wealthiest, but hey, story for another time. Fast forward to today, however, and everyone and their mum can go to one. Even if they're a complete moron. Why? So that they can get a piece of paper that they can use to beg for employment for more prestigious jobs, so that they don't have to do the jobs that nobody wants to do. So whereas in the past, people would simply be born, work in their hometown forever, and live relatively well, today, people are born, go to university, and then what? What do? Do they go back home and say, "Hey mom, that was fun. Anyway, what's for dinner?" Of course they don't. They move somewhere else where they can best take advantage of the newfound economic opportunities that said qualification supposedly provides. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what brain drain is. People moving away from their homes, sometimes very far away, in the pursuit of better wealth and opportunities. The consequence of what happens when location and skills are no longer interdependent. Brain drain can occur in 3 different ways: global brain drain, continental brain drain, and national brain drain. Let's start with global brain drain. Now, I don't think I need to insult your intelligence by saying that Earth is not at all equally economically developed, meaning that some places are much more economically prosperous than others. Monetarily speaking, there are 2 different types of countries: developing countries and developed countries. Developed countries typically have long life expectancy, are relatively stable, and of course, have a lot of wealth. Developing countries, however, as their name implies, are still in the process of catching up. Now, what developed countries do to developing countries is honestly absolutely sickening. It somewhat goes without saying that one of the best ways to accelerate a country's development is to ensure that its population is highly educated. And by highly educated, I don't mean things like sociology. No, a real education. As by having a skilled workforce, the nation will inevitably be more innovative, producing more goods and services that the market will desire, but also simply have much more highly useful professionals, such as doctors and nurses, that will keep the country moving forwards. Developing countries are of course aware of this, and thus try to educate their population to the best of their ability. But there's just one problem. The governments of developed nations realised that they could take advantage of developing nations by simply vacuuming up all of their professionals into their countries as soon as they graduate. For example, Ghana is a developing country in West Africa that has a population of around 32 million people and rising. Despite this, however, its nominal gross domestic product is only around $73 billion, or just $2,300 per person. Contrast this to a developed country with a roughly similar population, like Canada, which has a nominal gross domestic product of over $2 trillion, or $57,000 per person, and the economic differences between the two become very stark indeed. So you would think then that developed countries like Canada would respect developing countries like Ghana and let them develop as they did. But no. According to Ghana's own Official Statistics Institute, from 1999 to 2004, 54% of medical professionals trained during that time left to work abroad, mostly to work in other, more prosperous countries such as Canada, the UK, and the USA. The trend for young doctors and nurses to seek higher salaries and better working conditions, mainly in higher income countries in the West, is having serious impacts on the healthcare sector in Ghana. Whereas the United States has one doctor for every 430 people in the country, Ghana has just one doctor for every 6,700 people. A figure that is only exacerbated by such overwhelming levers, making the shortage of qualified professionals even worse than it already is. The average monthly wage for a doctor in Canada is around 23,500 Canadian dollars per month. The average monthly wage for a doctor in Ghana is around 11,900 Ghanaian cedi, 2,060 Canadian dollars per month. Looking at this, you can't really blame the average Ghanaian doctor from emigrating away from Ghana to countries like Canada, when over there they could earn more in a month than they usually would in a year. But this brings up an ethical question. Should the governments of developed countries be allowed to poach people away from the developing world, as they unashamedly are doing? And I suppose to answer that question, we should probably ask the people of developing nations what they think on the matter. I assume people that have good education just leave Ghana without developing the country. Most of them, yeah. That's very sad. Yes, it is. A wee little something called brain drain. All our greatest minds are going overseas, propping up other countries while ours fall. Yeah, needless to say, they're not very happy about it. And let's face it, who the hell can blame them? If over half my doctors were getting swallowed up by other nations, I'd be pretty damn livid too. Of course, you never hear about this from politicians in developed countries, especially within their sympathetic mainstream media apparatuses. Oh no. The only thing you'll ever hear from them is that everything is going great. Which, obviously it isn't. So remember, the next time you see a smiley-faced leader like Justin Trudeau talk about the joys of brain drain, know that they're not actually telling you the full story about how, 1. The mere fact that developed nations so desperately rely on imported workers in the first place shows that said nations have severe cultural issues at their core, and 2. Developed countries are actually robbing much of the developing world of their most educated citizens, and rapidly stunting their economic development in the process. I mean, how is Earth ever meant to reach some level of universal economic development if the poorest places on it are constantly being robbed by the richest? I don't know about you, dear viewer, but I can't help but think that this poaching needs to end, not just for them, but for the good of all mankind.
We like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other.
The second type of brain drain is continental brain drain. Whereas global brain drain occurs cross-continent, continental brain drain takes place, as its name implies, from within the same continent. The difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in terms of wealth is absolutely staggering. This picture, though from a decade ago now, still pretty much summarises it all, with Western Europe accounting for around 91% of all the wealth in Europe, and Eastern Europe having just the remaining 9% in comparison. Overall, the average Westerner is around 4.5 times richer than the average Easterner. Now, this isn't really much of a surprise, as after all, we all know why that is. Communism. For decades, the eastern states were remorselessly under the Iron Curtain, and it was only until the 1990s would they become free of the shackles that such a centrally planned economy brought, and have essentially been playing catch-up ever since. The mainstream narrative states that it is inevitable that Eastern Europe will one day catch up to Western Europe, and that everywhere within the continent will eventually be prosperous. However, from my observations, this is nonsense. Why? Because Eastern Europe is in a similar situation to Ghana, whereby when someone graduates from their educational establishments, rather than stay where they are, they simply move to somewhere else that will pay better, which, in this case, means Western Europe. For example, Bulgaria is one of the poorest countries in Europe. It has a population of almost 7 million people, yet only has a nominal gross domestic product of around $86 billion. Or $12,000 per person. Contrast this to a Western country, such as Denmark, that despite having 1 million people less than Bulgaria, still has an overall nominal gross domestic product that's over 4 times larger, and a much more prosperous people as a result, and the differences between the two become very obvious indeed. I had a friend in Bulgaria who was training to be a doctor, whereby she then planned to leave her country to go west for the better economic opportunities that it would provide. And looking at these numbers, again, who can blame them? But this brain drain is even worse for Eastern European countries like Bulgaria than it even is for Ghana, if you can believe it. Despite Bulgaria and Denmark both clearly being worlds apart economically, because they are both member states of the European Union, they have to ascribe to what is known as free movement of people. Meaning that every citizen of Bulgaria is entitled to live and work in Denmark, and all other EU countries for that matter, without the need to even apply. Now, this is great for the Easterners going west looking for a big pay rise, but not so much for the countries they're leaving behind, that more often than not, they never return back to. The Ghanaian government at least has an advantage whereby if its citizens want to leave their country, then they'll have to go through the often painstaking process of applying for citizenship elsewhere first. The Bulgarian government, however, doesn't have this advantage, as under EU free movement of people, it is utterly helpless in preventing its citizens from leaving. And that's exactly what they're doing. In 1985, Bulgaria's population was almost 9 million people. 30 years later, and that number has almost decreased by a third, to just 6.5 million people. Bulgaria is losing an average of 1.2% of its people every single year. But why? What's going on down there? War? Famine? No. Much of their young are simply emigrating away to the West in search of a more economically prosperous life. But it's not just that. You see, whereas Ghana obviously isn't too pleased about many of their most qualified citizens leaving the country, they do, at the very least, have a very stable population. As you can see, Ghana's population pyramid is extremely healthy, with more young people than old across the board. Bulgaria, on the other hand, is less of a pyramid and more of a diamond. At least Ghana, even with all the leavers, have a steady stream of people from one generation to the next to try to pick up the slack. Bulgaria, on the other hand, doesn't have such a privilege, as it barely produces any young people as it is, but those that do almost universally depart, leaving the nation in a state of terminal decline. And this phenomenon isn't just true for Bulgaria, but all of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe got old before it got rich. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain with it, many now newly independent Eastern European countries, understandably so desperate for economic prosperity, cozied up to Western Europe and signed up to its constructs, such as the European Union. And as stated, ever since, Western Europe has been vacuuming up as many young Eastern Europeans as it can, as to help subsidise its own declining populations, while leaving Eastern European countries in the dirt. Occasionally throwing them a few euros to shut them up, despite the fact that such payments will never amount to anything close to what has been robbed from them. A nation's ultimate asset, its people. Much of Eastern Europe is now essentially a walking museum. A retirement home of nations, mildly subsidised by their Western neighbours who have ripped them off, as to give them the illusion of economic progress. Depressing. Which brings us on nicely to the final form of brain drain. National brain drain. You know those rich countries I've been talking about that everyone wants to get to? The UK, USA, Canada, etc. Well, with the way I've been talking about them throughout this, you'd think that they were some sort of paradise, whereby the streets are paved with gold and everyone there lives happily ever after. But as someone who lives in one of these countries will tell you, this is simply not the case. Far from it, in fact. Within developed nations, there are of course places that are absolutely fantastic and most prosperous. But there are also other places that are just completely destitute and awful to live in. Now, this isn't exactly anything unusual, I mean, after all, West Germany is much richer than East Germany, Northern Italy is much richer than Southern Italy, and some states in America are much more prosperous than others. In my home country of the UK, specifically the nation of England, the amount of wealth you earn heavily depends on your geographic location. According to the British Office of National Statistics, the amount of annual disposable income the average person in the capital city of London has is around 30,000 Great British pounds. Meanwhile, up in the northeast, that number is around half, at a mere 17,000. The exact same country, just a few hours away on a train, has higher wages by almost double the amount. I've said it once, I'll say it again, and I'll never stop saying it. The sheer raw wealth divide in the United Kingdom is absolutely shameful, and the general rule in this country is that the further away from London you are, factually, the less you matter. Do you see where I'm going with this? Let me tell you the story of an old friend of mine called Pearl. Pearl was from Manchester, up here in the north. She graduated from university and became a scientist. Well, I say scientist. You know when you get a blood test? She's one of those weirdos who inspects your blood to make sure you're not eating too many burgers. However, Pearl quickly realised post-graduation that her newfound qualifications were pretty much wasted should she decide to stay in Manchester. As if she did the exact same job down in London, it would pay an absolute ton more. And so, Pearl, just like many other northerners, soon found herself living in, you guessed it, London. That's right, even within developed nations, brain drain is still a thing. The north of England and other less prosperous parts of the UK, such as neighbouring Wales and Scotland, are pretty much always guaranteed to be permanently poorer than that of the south, and especially London. Why? Because all of the country's wealth, businesses and opportunities have been purposely consolidated there, leaving the rest of the country out to dry. But here's the thing, there's a twist to this. You see, judging from what I've just said, you might be under the illusion that the north of England is this hovel of misery and despair, where people live in sheds and drink polluted water. Meanwhile, in London, everyone must live in a golden mansion and enjoy a daily dose of free Michelin-style lobster. But this couldn't be further from the truth. You see, while it is factually accurate to say that the North is poorer than London and is let down by the British government in almost every single regard, as bizarre as it sounds, when it comes to actual daily quality of life, the North, in many ways, is actually better than the capital. Don't believe me? Take house prices for example. Because everyone and their mum ends up moving to London, the demand for houses has gone through the roof there, vastly outstripping the supply. While the average house in the north is around £200,000 or so, in London, the exact same sized house could exceed over £1 million. £1 million for that. This has led to many poor people in London, what little of them remain, essentially being priced out of the city. Take my friend Pearl for example. Despite being a qualified professional who has quite a high wage by British standards, she still lives, and I am not making this up, in a rented basement in someone else's house. The Americans have a similar situation. You have guys over there who bust their balls off to get a computer science degree, move away from their still very rudely named flyover states to go to places like California, whereby they end up working for these giant multi-trillion-dollar corporations like Apple and earn what looks on paper to be a fortune, but in reality end up living in a pod with 5 other guys living on dolmio and ramen. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. If you don't move away from home, then you'll never make any decent money, but by moving away, you are almost guaranteed to end up living like a rat. So even when you get rich, you're still poor. To make matters worse, this consolidation of global wealth has created these, what I like to call, cosmopolitan cities. Places like London, Paris and Los Angeles that have developed a completely alien culture to not just the rest of the world, but especially the rest of their countries. They are the unholy combo of being hardcore socially progressive, while at the same time being hardcore economically conservative. AKA a godless, individualistic and selfish culture. When people move into these hellhole cities, something happens to them. They change slowly, they just become insufferable. Take Pearl for example. When she was in Manchester, she was great, but after a year of staying in London, and my god, she turned into a right snob. Then again, if I spent my prime years grinding away for a piece of paper to tell me I'm smart, only to end up living in a basement, I'd probably be pretty cheesed off as well. To make matters worse, because the people living in these cities end up having a disproportionate amount of wealth, power, and fame, they tend to dominate their nation's media apparatuses, whereby their beliefs and policies are completely and utterly unaligned to the rest of their country and the wider world at large, resulting in huge bitterness and desire for revenge from the rest of us lowly peasants. As can be witnessed in both left-wing and right-wing movements like MAGA, Brexit, Scottish independence, and much, much more. The global economy now functions like this weird pyramid scheme where everyone but those on the top lose. At the bottom, you have the people of developing countries, like Ghana, who have their professionals vacuumed away from them, cursed to infinitely slower economic development. Then you have the better off but still not great Eastern European countries, who due to their ageing populations are practically museums of stagnation. Then you have the poor parts of developed countries, like the north of England, which are practically barren of opportunity and living off subsidiaries. Then you have their other countrymen, people living in terrible cramped cities like London, that though are wealthy on paper, are actually working themselves to the bone while living like rats. And finally, right at the top, you have the real winners of this entire scheme, the actual wealthy people of our world, aka millionaires and billionaires. Everyone on this pyramid almost always tends to blame those who were above them, except the city dwellers, who have been convinced by the millionaires and billionaires above them to blame those under them, aka the culture war. The fact is that this consolidation of wealth into these cosmopolitan cities simply must end. Otherwise, the developing world will simply never develop, and the developed world will inevitably have a peasants' revolt and tear itself apart into irrelevancy. So, enough whining. What can be done? What can actually be done to fix this problem? Well, in order to fix it, we're going to have to implement viable solutions on every layer of the brain drain phenomenon. So let's start with global brain drain. There's a very simple way to fix global brain drain, and that's remittance. In the Caribbean island of Jamaica, over 80% of people who earn a higher educational qualification end up living abroad. That's right, 80%, 4 out of 5. But though this may sound disastrous on paper, it's nowhere near as bad as it sounds. Why? Remittance. Remittance is when people who move to work in other countries send money back to their home country. Believe it or not, around 20% of Jamaica's entire gross domestic product actually comes from remittance already. The problem with remittance, however, is that, for the most part, it's optional. People sending money to their families back home to give them a helping hand. My argument, however, is that developing countries should make remittance mandatory. In order to be eligible to earn a higher educational qualification, the governments of said nations should make their citizens agree to a mandatory remittance tax beforehand, should they decide to leave the country to work abroad. By doing this, even if they do leave, the country will still get money it can use to develop, and if they don't leave, well, then the country will retain its professionals and likewise develop faster. Either way, they win. Job done. Next, continental brain drain. Remittance would also work here too, honestly. However, when engaged in constructs such as the European Union, whereby your country is essentially a vassal state, even the very idea of mandatory remittance would simply be shot down. Unfortunately, from my observations, most politicians in Eastern Europe are more than aware of how the European Union dominates their nations, but still see it as the lesser of two evils. Russia, and the oppression it provided, still lingers on in the minds of many, with recent events not doing much to rid such thoughts. The political class of Eastern Europe, and many average people outside of it for that matter, would seemingly rather engage in a voluntary comfy managed decline into irrelevancy via the EU than ever risk becoming a Russian vassal again. But chaps, there is a third option. You are aware. To ensure that Eastern Europe doesn't get taken advantage of by your much wealthier neighbours in Western Europe, you should become economically independent, which can be easily achieved by leaving the European Union and creating your own monetary bloc to replace it. Think the Visegrad Group, but more. And in addition, to ensure that Eastern Europe doesn't get bullied by your much more militaristic neighbours in Russia to the east, you should become militarily independent, which can also be easily achieved by getting your own nuclear weapons. By focusing on becoming as independent as possible, both economically and militarily, you won't continue to get bossed around by your two much larger neighbours, as you have done for the last 100 plus years. It's time for you to take back control, stop thinking r/Europe is real life, and get off this sinking ship before it sinks you with it. Job done. And finally, national brain drain. National brain drain can easily be fixed by what I like to call tax zones. The way that developed countries work now is that corporations pay the same tax no matter where in the country they are based. In 1973, the main rate of corporation tax in the UK was 52%. However, with every year that passed, it has only slowly gradually decreased, until today, where it's at a staggeringly low 19%. Or as I like to call it, a boiling frog robbery of the British people. With tax zones, however, you could set the corporate tax rate to be higher in more economically prosperous parts of the country, while lowering them in more impoverished areas, tinkering with them as you see fit. The results of this would be, in the short term, the additional tax revenue generated could be used to develop such poor areas, but in the long term, businesses would inevitably start to move away from consolidated areas in order to lower their annual overheads, slowly spreading the wealth and job opportunities across the country as a whole. At the same time, this would also make housing much more affordable for the average person living in cities like London due to the inevitable lower demand for such properties, which would simultaneously demolish the out-of-touch progressive bubbled culture that such cities tend to possess, which is only possible to maintain via such unethical consolidation. And one more time, job done. Now, of course, do I expect any of these completely logical solutions to actually be implemented? Of course not. Such financial solutions aren't in the best economic interests of corporations, nor their political puppet pawns. And as such, this pyramid nightmare will sadly only continue to stand until the entire global economic system completely and utterly collapses. And oh man, will you wish you listened to me then. After that, however, when the dust settles, in the coming decades I am confident that such rational policies will inevitably be implemented by a much more braver, moral, and much less individualistic generation. And the results of such will be a hugely more prosperous developing world, a more highly equitable set of continents, and an infinitely more stable landscape within already developed nations, which will, in the end, result in an Earth that no matter where you are on it, we will all be able to be proud of. And amen to that. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that. Spread the word of the pain of brain drain, because let me tell you, if this carries on, our Earth is going to be a very grim place indeed. As ever, I'm curious, have you been affected by brain drain at all? It's almost a guarantee everyone has. I mean, almost everyone that I know has moved somewhere else or knows someone who has. I mean, this is not a rare phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. It's very upsetting. Regardless, as ever, I'd like to give a shout out to the Wall of Famers. My 2 pence. Ziories. I'm sure I've got it right this time. Ardent Word, who I know for a fact has suffered via brain drain, I remember. Philippe M. Daniel H, welcome sir. Wes FR. V, welcome to you sir. Scrophilus Rex, Andrew Hamrick, Denton Cassells, The Bob Page, and BW Gaming. The men, the myths, the legends. All such remarkable gentlemen who are now very well educated in the pain of brain drain. Oh, I tell you, sometimes I get the urge to just buy a piece of land in the middle of nowhere and make my own farm, but then I realise I'm a massive germaphobe and I don't know how to farm, so... But I'm sure everyone's thought of that at some point. Honestly, it seems like the only way to beat brain drain. Either way, I'll see you next time.